Ladies and gentlemen, the Philippine National Anthem.
Mayang magiliw, kaya sa silangan, alalang ng puso, sa dibdib mo'y buhay. Lumang hinirang, duyan ka ng magiging, sa manlulupig, di ka masisi. Sa nagagat mundong susimayan, sa langit mamahal, may nilagang tulad, awit sa panlayang minamahal. Ang kislap ng watawat mo'y tagumpay na nagdininig. Ang bituin at araw niyang kailan pa may di magdidilim. Lupa ng araw ng walang ating pagsinta, buhay langit sa piling mo. Aming ligaya lamang may mga mamatay ng dahil sa'yo.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I am Dr. Fernando A. Santiago Jr., Director of the Southeast Asia Research Center and Hub of De La Salle University, and welcome to this webinar with Professor Chris Mabey, author of Whispers of Hope, a Family Memoir of Myanmar, published by Penguin. This event is jointly organized by Search, the Bienvenido N. Santos Creative Writing Center, represented by its director, Dr. Ronald Baitan, and the DLSU Department of Literature, represented by its chair, Dr. Anne Frances Sangil. Now, I would like to inform our audience that we shall have an open forum after the talk, and you may opt to ask your questions later. But you may also type your questions in the chat box or the Q&A box at any point in time. Now, we will try our best to accommodate all your questions in this hour-long webinar. Now, for the welcome remarks, I have the pleasure to introduce the Chair of the Department of Literature, Dr. Anne Frances Sangil.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Frances, and I welcome you all to Whispers of Hope, a Family Memoir of Myanmar, a webinar with Chris Mabey, Emeritus Professor from Middlesex University Business School in London. When Dr. Fernie Santiago, the director of De La Salle University Southeast Asia Research Center and Hub, invited the Department of Literature to serve as its partner in this activity, there was no hesitation from our end, only certainty in our willingness to take part in this remarkable and timely undertaking. Not only do we value such collaborations that highlight the department's and also the university's thrust in research and cultural studies that contribute to our better understanding of ourselves in relation to our neighboring countries, but we also realize how such partnerships illustrate the department's vision mission in terms of literary production, pedagogy, and research, how we wish to nurture scholars and artists who are conscious and appreciative of their cultural heritage, and who will make significant contributions to Philippine and Asia-Pacific literature and culture, and who will use their creative and critical eye for the betterment of the nation and the glory of God. As our Southeast Asian neighbor and brother, Myanmar is sometimes close yet also far. We may hear stories coming out from that part of the region occasionally, especially when things get much worse than what is par for the course. But as we are always embroiled in our own national concerns and heartaches, very seldom do we really take a pause and wonder about the actual state of affairs in Myanmar. With the recent military junta, reported human rights violations, displacements of many people, economic woes, protests left and right, one may in fact wonder if we are talking about Myanmar or the Philippines. In fact, during the recent presidential debate hosted by the Commission on Elections, Labor leader and presidential candidate Leody de Guzman, in response to the current Myanmar situation, said how our own government has no credibility when it comes to human rights, that our own government does not respect its own citizens and is the chief violator of human rights in the country. It seems Leody believes that while both countries are in the same boat, this government does not have the right nor the moral authority to call out the atrocities coming out of Myanmar, like the pot calling the kettle black. Even Vice President and presidential candidate Leni Robredo had some things to say about Myanmar, and in a separate debate said that we must make a clear stance that we will not support anyone who violates human rights because this is against our own value system, that we must keep an active participation in the ASEAN, as well as in the regional coalition of nations, and use this as a vehicle to articulate our non-support for such human rights violations and violators. All well and good, but on the ground, how do our words take effect? How does our collective condemnation impact the realities overseas, if at all? What hope is there for the people of Myanmar? Is there any hope left, albeit whispers and echoes in the dark? Today, we are fortunate to have Chris Mabey share his insights with us about Myanmar and perhaps offer some more hope in this time of uncertainty. And maybe by proxy, we can also get some of that hope for ourselves. It is a currency that we all need to survive today and one that can buy us a better tomorrow. Thank you to DLSU Search and to Dr. Fernie Santiago, and to the Bienvenido and Santos Creative Writing Center under its director, Dr. Ronald Baitan, for having us, the Department of Literature, as your partner in this endeavor. We look forward to more engaging activities with you in the future. Maraming salamat po, Animo Lasal.
Maraming salamat, Dr. Sangil. Now, I shall introduce our speaker. He is a writer, psychologist, and emeritus professor at Middlesex University Business School, London, UK. He has held a career-long interest in how organizations develop their leaders. Initially, this was with British Telecom and Rank Xerox. More recently, his research and writing have turned to ethical leadership and the enigma of cultural leadership in Myanmar. He recently led an ESRC-funded seminar series on ethical leadership, philosophical and spiritual approaches. Our speaker has 11 academic books to his name and 20 refereed papers, each subject to critical peer review. One text he authored in Human Resource Management has sales of more than 21,500 copies. Now, since marrying into a Burmese family in 1973, he has been a keen observer of Myanmar, making frequent visits with his wife and on one occasion with his 4 daughters. So without much further ado, ladies and gentlemen, Professor Chris Mabey.
Thank you, Fernie. I really appreciate the invitation to come and speak. I'll just get my slides up. Fernie, if you could just help me here to, if I just start slideshow, is that the best way of doing it?
That's correct.
Yeah, okay. Okay, is that
No, it's not in slideshow yet.
okay?
Perhaps you can try the resume slideshow button. Do you see it? it's below that. That one, yes.
Okay. So is that, can the participants
We
see
can
that
see it
now?
now. Yes.
Okay. Okay, well, thank you for the introduction and for this opportunity. I'm really excited about it because I've spoken about Myanmar at various seminars and conferences in the UK and just recently in Dubai, but this is the first chance to speak with my Asian friends. And I'm hoping that in the question and answer part of this session, I'll be learning from you as well as hopefully informing you. As Fernie mentioned, my interest in Myanmar is really through marriage, and the visit we made in 95, 96 with our 4 daughters who were teenagers at the time was a real eye-opener. It dispelled a lot of my romantic images of Myanmar, and the kind of reality set in. It was like depth charges going off in our children's minds. And for April, returning after 30 years was also quite an emotional trip. We also had the opportunity to speak to Aung San Suu Kyi for about half an hour, and that was a very memorable interchange. It was a pivot really in my understanding of Myanmar. It really triggered an interest in what was going on, because the headlines we get, and possibly you get in Manila and the Philippines, are very negative, and they give a fairly black and white picture. And my reading of Myanmar, as I visited again and again, and we visited 7 times over the period from 2010 till now, was that it's a much more nuanced picture. And what I want to do today is, if you like, unpeel some of those layers to help us understand better what's going on, if you like, the psyche of Myanmar. So 3 questions. What makes Myanmar a special case? What are the factors that drive and resist change in Myanmar, and what next? Which I think is probably the overriding question. Everybody I talk to about Myanmar are saying, what's going to happen? You know, it just looks like a stalemate. How can things turn out in a more hopeful way? So just a word about the book. I wasn't planning to write a book, but I was talking to April, my wife's family, who were giving me firsthand detail, very intimate reminiscences of Burma as it was then in the 40s, 50s, 60s. And I started to write down and started to tape what they were telling me, because it was just like oral history in the making. And only later did I realize that I had a whole data set, ethnographic data set, from which to write. And so the book, which you can see the image of there, is 3 things. It's actually a memoir of April's family. It's a love story of how April and I came together and continue to stay together despite cultural differences. And it's also, if you like, an insight into this more nuanced picture of Myanmar. And if you want to know more and you want a good read, I recommend you getting the book. We can tell you how to get it later. But going back to these 3 questions, why is Myanmar a special case? Well, first of all, and some of these things will be familiar or true of other countries in Asia as well, but I think if you add them all up, it does create a unique picture. First of all, Myanmar is made up of at least 130 different people groups. And these are people with their own proud history and heritage and ethnicity and language, and fighting for their rights, fighting for human rights. The Kachin, the Chin, the Karen, the Shan, you know, there are many, many groups. They perhaps amongst the most prominent, but it really is, the boundary of Myanmar is pretty artificial, really, because you've got all these different people groups situated within. I think the other thing that is noticeable and possibly unique is that since Ne Win first came to power in 1962 with the military coup, the country has actually been in civil war in one shape or form. There's been an ongoing rumbling, strife and tension and fighting and militia groups fighting against each other. And that hasn't abated for 2 generations. It's still going on today. Thirdly, the interesting thing about Myanmar that I've often reflected on is that it is very fundamentally a Buddhist country. 90% of the population would call themselves Buddhists, and that Buddhist Theravada Buddhism, it seeps into the soul of the nation, and qualities like compassion and kindness and tolerance and pacifism. These are just in the DNA of the Burmese people, generally speaking. Yet, and this is the interesting thing, every now and again, it's like the suppressed anger of the people erupts, as rather than deferring, they just kind of the temper just frays, and there's outbursts of rebellion. And this happened in 1988. It happened in 2007, led by the Buddhist monks, interestingly enough, so-called Saffron revolution, and then again, most recently, a year ago, when the year-long state of emergency was imposed by the junta. So you've got this pacifism and then these outbursts of rebellion and revolt. And then I guess a final thing, not unique to Myanmar, is the cloak of secrecy. Until recently, certainly, the government specialized in misinformation and keeping things very private. They were very introspective as a nation, cut themselves off from the rest of the world, and became a very mysterious, enigmatic nation. So we've got Myanmar as a special case. If I can just move on to the visit of Pope Francis in 2017. He came and spoke in Naypyidaw, which is the capital of Myanmar, as you probably know, and he's speaking to the diplomats and social activists and government officials. And his assessment was this: the future of Myanmar must be peace, a peace based on respect for dignity and rights of each member of society, each ethnic group and its identity, the rule of law, and a democratic order that enables each person and every group to offer its legitimate contribution to the common good. And maybe those words don't sound particularly radical, but given the situation in Myanmar, this was a real challenge, I think, to the regime to actually take these things seriously. And I wanted to use this as, if you like, the core of my talk, because I think that assessment has a lot of things. There are a lot of factors which actually could help it happen, but there are some resisting forces too. I mean, this is just a picture to give you a flavor of, I think this is a group of Karenni people up in the hills. The Irrawaddy Basin and Lower Burma is where the Bamar live. These are the dominant people group. They're dominant in terms of ethnicity and politics. And oh, sorry, I'll go to this slide now. But a lot of the ethnic groups are more rural, much poorer, very few land rights, often being pushed on, often displaced, and really lacking in education, lacking in opportunity. So what are the driving factors? So taking the peace and prosperity, I don't know whether you're familiar with force field analysis. It's a tool I use as a management consultant in businesses and in organizations. If you can imagine a central line down the page here being peace and prosperity for Myanmar. And then on the left-hand side, you have a number of factors which, if you like, are pushing into that and helping to make it happen. And then on the other side, obviously, there are some restraining forces too, which we'll discuss in a moment. And the whole point in organizational terms or in national terms is how to strengthen the driving factors and how to diminish or address or somehow ameliorate the restraining factors, so that the equilibrium moves to the right and becomes increasingly real on the ground. And I just thought that might be an interesting way of looking at the situation in Myanmar. So I'll go through these fairly quickly, and we can pick them up in question time later. But first of all, the genie is out of the bottle. What I mean by that is that despite disinformation and secrecy, in the last 10 or 15 years, particularly, young people in Myanmar have become much more aware of other countries and other ways of governing more democratically. This is through, there's 80% mobile phone usage in Myanmar, and particularly young people are very media savvy. So they've become, their eyes have been opened to different ways of operating, and they've become very restless and very impatient with the stranglehold of the junta, the military junta, which has been in power for so long. And I think it's clear that the will of the people is for a more democratic situation. And you know, we see this. Sorry, got some notes here which I'll refer to. We see this in the various revolts that I've just mentioned, where the temper has frayed and where people have come out on the streets and protested. And so it's like the general population, the majority want obviously a different way of life, but they're just held under the thumb of the junta, because the junta have the power, they have the weaponry, they have the support of Russia and China, and so the people are unable to find the freedom and the democracy that they want. And there was a hope, I think, with the National League for Democracy, the NLD, first of all winning a landslide election in 1988, but not being allowed to take up their seats, and then again in 2011 and 15, and finally in 2015 the NLD delegates took up their place in Parliament. They had didn't have a majority, even though the election result was a landslide, because the military allocated 25% of the seats for themselves. But there was hope that this would bring about change at a state level. I have to say that hope has been a little bit tarnished a lot of people we speak to in Myanmar are impatient with the NLD. They don't seem to be working and operating as effectively and swiftly in bringing change as was hoped. And of course, now that there is this state of emergency, the whole thing has, the whole opportunity for the NLD to assert themselves has been undermined, not least because their leader, Aung San Suu Kyi, is, as you know, under arrest or actually been incarcerated for a number of trumped up charges. So that's one that is a possibility for driving change, but at the moment is very much limited. Another factor that I think over time will have possibly a seismic effect is the what I call millennials returning. So these are people who have left Myanmar, had secondary education for what it's worth, because education is very piecemeal and threadbare in Myanmar, but they've managed to get a scholarship. There are many organizations which award scholarships for students to study outside of Myanmar, and then with the training and skills and experience that they've got, to go back. This is the condition, that they go back and start working at community level. And to take one example, Prospect Burma, an organization I'm familiar with here in London, have actually over 30 years given scholarships to 1,400 alumni who are back in Myanmar, working in different sectors of telecommunications, education, health, mining, and so on. And this is, this I think is a real signal of hope. And then there's what I would call leadership from within. Sometimes individuals, one such individual is Cardinal Charles Maung Bo, who was appointed by Pope Francis. He's very outspoken, he's very respected. The authorities seem to leave him alone. Perhaps they're afraid that if they do anything to him, there'll be a backlash. But he speaks out very courageously and consistently about the atrocities in Myanmar. There's also Anna Sui Klang, who is the wife of the Myanmar Vice President, Henry Van Thieu. And interesting, she's born Chin, from the Chin tribe, and she grew up in Yangon, what was Rangoon. And she is an activist, she's a linguist, she's a researcher, she's a Christian preacher, and she writes extensively and researches extensively on language, human rights, and female emancipation. So, you know, I'm sure she's not allowed to be too vocal, being right in the center of government, but she is a person that we can at least pray for, that she would have the courage and the influence that she deserves. And then leadership in terms of groups. There's two groups at the moment: the civil disobedience movement and the national unity government, which have, if you like, arisen organically over the last year in response to the state of emergency. And again, without being idealistic about it, I do think that if change comes, political change comes, then these two groups, who are formed by civil servants, teachers, people who are educated and well experienced in influencing and leadership, they could actually be quite instrumental in bringing about change. Now, the restraining factors, a big sigh really, because, you know, the impotency of external players is so frustrating, whether this be the US and the UK governments, which I'm more familiar with in the West, just, if you like, being taken in by the junta around the 2011 2012 mark, when it looked like there was a move by the government towards more democratic principles. And we dropped our sanctions and we started to invest. And I think that was premature and naive and has played into the hands of the junta. But also ASEAN has again often spoken about the injustice, but has so far been very impotent in terms of doing anything. I think the latest move is by I think the chair of ASEAN at the moment, Hun Sen, is from Cambodia. And the difficulty is if ASEAN makes moves to discuss and to try and sue for peace with the junta, it actually gives the junta legitimacy, which they don't deserve. So there is a bit of a struggle here, you know, how do you deal with the country when you're only speaking to the ones who are illegitimately pulling the strings? And then the UN Human Rights Council and General Assembly, they're very well informed about the atrocities in Myanmar, but again, unwilling to do anything or unable because they need a majority or a unanimous vote. And of course, two players in that General Assembly are Russia and China, and it suits them to keep the junta in place for the moment. Which leads me on to Chinese influence, which is huge in Myanmar, as you probably know. 82 of 113 investment projects in Rangoon are Chinese. It just shows the level of business influence. The Chinese are building an economic corridor, 1,700 kilometer corridor from the border, the northern border with Burma, right through Burma to the Indian Ocean, which is where it gives them access to the Middle East and to the West. It's a special economic zone, and there is this uneasy alliance between China and the junta, which is keeping things keeping the junta in place, really. There's the psychology of the generals. I haven't got time to talk about that in detail, but it's just, if you like, I have written a paper about that, a conference paper, which I can refer you to. But basically, it's this idea of a small elite group who have high need for power and a high need for influence and low empathy, actually managing to dictate the terms of citizenship for the whole nation. So they're totally outnumbered, but they have the power. And psychologists papers I've read talk about pathocracy, which it happens in different countries. You probably can think of other countries too, where there is this dominance by this social dominance, political dominance by a small group. And then there's the lack of legislative responsibility or accountability. And again, I could say more on this, but from a legal standpoint, it's worth remembering that lawyers were only allowed to retrain or to train from 2014 onwards. Up to that point, there was no training of legal professionals. So you can see how immature the legal environment is, and various human rights have yet to be ratified. The International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights and the Convention Against Torture are two, if you like, basic human rights pieces of legislation, which the military junta in Myanmar has not yet ratified. So, you know, and on all those factors, I think at the moment, looking at this force field it's like the restraining factors are more dominant, and hence any change, any shift that Pope Francis wanted to identify is at standstill, and possibly even being pushed back. So it doesn't look very promising. But let me move on quickly. This is just a picture. I bring this in because one of the things we've done, my wife April and I, is we have taught at a Bible college in Yangon for 7 years, visiting each year for a few weeks. And these are just some of the students. And I wanted to show it because it shows the rather primitive classrooms. What you don't see is that there's a whiteboard nailed to the wall, and that's the extent of the teaching technology. The other thing you see is quite a range of different appearances. These are different rural ethnic groups in Myanmar: Chin, Lisu, Karen. Yeah, I'm just trying to identify some of the others. And their expression says it all. They want to be there. They're delighted to. I mean, it's $1 a day. This is a very shoestring college, but they are eager to learn. And most of them have a Christian faith, and most of them want to learn, but their English is poor, and their education up till now has been woeful. But they're there and they want to learn, and it's an absolute delight to be involved in their lives and to see them graduate and go back into their communities and into their villages with a confidence, and to become leaders almost straight away because they've got the advantage of biblical training and leadership training. That's what we brought. Lincoln, who's the principal, and his team bring a lot of the biblical theological training, and then he asks us to bring leadership training. So that's exciting. So moving on to, if you like, the last question, which is, okay, where from here? What chance is there of things turning out for the better? And it goes without saying that I don't think anything can happen of any significance, lasting significance, until there is peace building. And this is the big conundrum. This is the big stumbling block at the moment, that the junta looks like they feel they're intransigent. They look like there's no opportunity to negotiate, to bring about a more democratic solution. What can one say? I personally feel their time is up. They're hanging on to power. I think for all their bravado, they're extremely paranoid, and their confidence is thin. Okay, they've got the weaponry, but the people have spoken, as it were, and they know that they are intensely unpopular. They probably don't care because their empathy is very low. But my reading is that the National Unity Government will gradually gain power, probably on the periphery, in Thailand and on the borders, in terms of its influence. And there will come a point when the popular revolt gets behind the National Unity Government, a shadow government, and there is the opportunity to actually negotiate with a beleaguered junta who are politically isolated apart from this link, particularly to China. The re-establishing or restabilizing the economy is also crucial. I mean, the UN Development Programme have warned that because of the pandemic, which I haven't even mentioned, but like you in Philippines has been disastrous, and because of the political crisis, they predict that as many as 25 million people, 25 million people, that's, you know, more than a third of the population of Myanmar will slide into poverty this year. So that's a very gloomy forecast. And again, something will have to be done for that to be averted, and it has to be radical, and it has to be swift. And then there's education. Education is a key for me. Being an educationalist, I would say that, but I think with the return of the millennials and with the improvement in educational standards, will over the medium to long term make a huge difference as people become more aware and more equipped and more adept at dealing with the politics around them, and dealing with the legal framework that I've referred to. And then the human rights need to be restored. This again will be not just changing laws, but changing attitudes. And I guess if I'm looking at those four things, I'm thinking, it doesn't look too hopeful. But I think underlying a lot of the things I've been saying, I can think of people and I can think of groups who are impassioned, who are courageous, and who are willing to protest despite personal sacrifice. And I think a change will come. But I think outside agencies need to help that happen. And it's got to happen soon. And I just finished there with 2 or 3 outputs. If you're interested in finding out more about the story of April and myself, there's a couple of interviews there on Premier Christian Radio, which I've heard even our children say, gosh, that was good. When are the next ones coming out? So if your children say that, then it must be pretty good and enjoyable to listen to. The second thing there, the military rule in Myanmar, a case of pathocracy, is where I developed this idea of how psychological research can inform our understanding of what's going on in Myanmar. And then if you like, a more personal, a faith-based piece I've written for Premier Christianity, which includes some thoughts on how to pray. I just thought I'd put those up for those of you who are interested in pursuing this further. So I think I finished the formal part of my talk. I just need to get back to the main slide. If you can help me, Fanny, do I just stop sharing screen?
I can stop it for you.
Okay.
I'm sorry, it's not responding. Would you know how to do it?
Should I do stop share?
There we go. Yes. Yes. Yes.
Okay.
So
I'm open to questions. Yeah, over to you.
Okay. Well, thank you, Professor Mabey. Okay. Chris Mabey is currently in London, where I understand it is 10:30 around or almost 11 o'clock in the morning. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, the person I invited to ask questions this afternoon is currently in Kyoto, Japan. Okay. And I have the pleasure to introduce Dr. Carlos Piocos III to raise some questions about your book and your talk. But before that, if you don't mind, Dr. Piocos, I'd like to invite our audience to please join the conversation. Okay, you may do so by raising your hand, and I can activate your microphone. Should you prefer to type your questions, okay, you may also do so in the chat box or the Q&A box. Okay, so feel free to share your questions at any point in time. Now, like I said, I have invited Dr. Carlos Piocos III to raise some questions. Dr. Piocos is Professor of Literature and Cultural Studies at the De La Salle University Department of Literature. He is an Associate for Poetry and Cultural Studies at the Bienvenido Santos Center. And he is also a Research Fellow of the Southeast Asia Research Center and Hub. Okay, so perhaps let's just wait for, there we go. Okay, so ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Carlos Biocos.
Thank you very much, Fernie. Thank you very much, Professor Chris Mabey, for that wonderful talk about your book. I think the talk largely sort of describes the afterword of the book. But I think at the heart of the book Whispers of Hope is really a beautiful family history. And I think perhaps if we can have time before some of my comments here, perhaps we can ask you to read some of your favorite excerpt, just even for just briefly from the book. But I love the dynamics of intimacy and distance in the way you narrated the story of the various levels and the various layers of story here. This is about Myanmar or Burma, but also this is about your love story with your wife, April. It's also about the life you built together as a family in the UK, but dealing with some of the history that you also starts to unearth as your wife and your wife's parents and family tries to deal with the history that they thought that they have left behind. So this is why the whole book is so astounding to me as I'm reading it, because I was just so amazed by how much you're trying to be, how much of those stories are filtered through the lens of trauma from April and April's family. That's why I think much of the story is framed by really this intimacy, because you're the only one who can access these kinds of stories, but with enough distance to be able to narrate and structure it. And I also like how, I think towards the end, I like how you describe your wife, April, because much of the story, or much of the way that you are trying to frame and understand Myanmar, Burma's history, Burmese history, Burmese culture, and sort of how it's relevant to what's happening now, is also via how you observe your wife's mood, because a lot of the things, and I love that you talk about how your wife is also has this cloak of secrecy, that and you're just trying to look into subtext. And as a reader, as I was reading it, I was put into this position that I think there's also so much. The author is also admitting that there's so much more subtext that we might be missing. That's why it's also an invitation to study more, to study our neighbors more, to study this beautiful but also very complex country more. I think this is where my commentary ends and my question starts. At the heart of the book, it's also about, I think, this idea of trying to understand Myanmar through your experience as Christians. And I was reminded of this because at page, I think, 79 of the book, you talk about osmosis and how the country might be changed by contact, because as you've observed somewhere in the book as well, Buddhists, the idea of Buddhists to withdraw from the world seems to have been taken to the advantage by the Tatmadaw, or the junta, the fascist junta, because they were able to translate this towards isolation. They were able to use the Buddhist virtue of withdrawing from the world as a way for them to justify politically and culturally and even religiously how they should isolate themselves from the world, and that made it easier for them to control the country for so many years. But I think it's also the way you frame it that is very Christian. I think the idea that contact would be able to by looking at the world, uh, you'll be the country might be changed by osmosis. So I would want you to talk a little bit about that, because I think towards the end that is also what some of the promises, what glimmers of hope is coming from the millennials that you've interviewed, from the young idealists that you've interviewed, who have seen the world through travel, through studying, through their leadership skills, via developing leadership skills, and how all of this might be, in a sense, might give a glimmer of hope. But perhaps, Sir Chris, before you, Professor Chris, because I know that Sir might have very different connotations in the UK. But Professor Chris, perhaps you might want to read an excerpt from the book so that the audience would be able to understand the book a little bit more. Thank you.
Thank you, Carlos. Yes, you've very nicely captured something here. On the one hand, the nation is very introspective, if I can talk generally, and politically has cut itself off from the rest of the world. And I don't think it's a coincidence that Theravada Buddhism is the, if you like, the dominant thought process and meditative process within the country, because that also is inward looking. I'm not saying it doesn't have an external impact, but essentially it's about staying introspective, staying quiet and peaceful within yourself. And that is definitely a flavor washes through into the deference, I think, of the majority of the people, putting up with huge inconvenience and a huge oppression for so many years. And if I can put it this way, I think I can say that for the average Burmese family to settle down to a meal together with family and with friends who are passing through, they want nothing more than that. I don't mean to say that you know that they don't have more noble thoughts, and they aren't they're a very sophisticated people, but essentially it's this hospitality, it's this generosity, it's this kindness, which is just part of their DNA. And but interestingly enough, and this is what you've just touched on, April, who came to the UK when she was 13, she'd moved schools 6 times in the space of about 5 years. And I think we all can imagine what that does to one, because you just protect yourself by staying within yourself. And there's one, and so when I came to write this book, which I never really intended to do initially, April wasn't particularly interested or excited about it. She didn't really want me to do it because she was afraid of exposure, if you can understand that. And an early draft of the book, one of the criticisms, which I asked for criticism, and one of them was, well, you're writing about April and her family, but I don't hear April's voice. Where is she? And so I went back to April on many occasions, had to choose the right moment and the right mood, and to ask her, can you tell me more about this? Can you tell me more about that? And gradually, some of the detail came out. So at a national level, there is this, a cultural level, there's this introspection, and April kind of exemplified it, partly because of her upbringing. But let me just read a couple of pieces since you asked, Carlos. Many decades on, I still hear snatches of April's younger days for the first time. It's like a patchwork quilt that's being made over a lifetime. Only now am I beginning to understand her reticence. I don't like talking about myself, she says. Why? Why, it's private. It's not relevant. And there's a definiteness in April's tone. I'm interested. Other people are interested. Are they? I don't think they understand. They switch off because they can't identify. I get that. Friendships don't last because you're always moving schools. You learn to become self-sufficient. A way of protecting yourself, perhaps? Yes, I suppose I don't want to be exposed. Well, what's the fear? There's no fear. It's just a fact. April can be very literal. I can see it's uncomfortable territory for April. And also I can see the irony of writing a book about her and her family. It settles on my shoulder like an ungainly bird. What are you doing? The bird seems to be whispering in my ear, making all this personal stuff so public. I sit back, feeling slightly chastised. For me, it was also the language, April says, finally, especially in the early days in this country. I found it difficult to express myself. I had to take English O-level twice. It really hindered my education. So you've got used to keeping your thoughts to yourself, I say, more of a statement than a question. The thing is, this can come across as acceptance of not having strong views. I think a lot of people see you as a good listener, which you are, but they fail to see the real you. It's like they're dealing with the sentry at the entrance to the tent rather than the general inside. And so there's this, I mean, I'm still learning stuff about April. It's like a deep pool. and I just give you one more quotation. This is towards the very end. A conversation a few months back with April. April says, "Where's my magazine?" "It's upstairs." "What's up there?" "Your magazine." "I know." "Well, if you knew, why did you ask me?" "I didn't ask you, I was talking to myself." Then there's a long pause. "Can you tell me more about Burma?" So I'm still interested in getting some more details from her. "No." I mean, she really said it like that. "No." "Why not?" "It's something you can't write or talk about." "I just want to understand better." "You have to read between the lines." "What lines?" "You're not giving me any lines to read between." So there is this tension between writing about her and her family and her being a very private individual, but very strong. And people see her as a pushover. I mean, some people. But I know that behind the demure, quiet, unhurried kind of silence or few words, there is a very strong personality. And I think that's almost like a picture of Burma itself. I'm not saying she typifies because she's come out of Burma at the age of 13. You know, she's had the second half of her education was British. She still speaks Burmese. And when we go back, it's very interesting that within a few conversations, she's rattling off in Burmese. And I see a totally different person, you know, in front of me. She's authoritative, she's genial, she's out, you know, expressive. It's a really interesting thing. And I think, goodness me, what have I married, you know? Anyway, Carlos, that's just a couple of brief excerpts, which I think address the things you were getting at. Hope they do.
Thank you very much, Professor Chris. So we have in audience students and scholars of both creative writing and literature and Southeast Asian studies. I think some of them are also political science majors. So there's a lot of interest in your book, and so I'm opening the floor now for questions. So you can ask. For our audience, you can raise your hand and you can ask your question directly to Professor Chris, or you can type your question at the chat box. Anyone? So while they are probably constructing some of their questions to you, would you want to talk about where they can buy the book first?
Yes, I think Fanny may have the details on that.
Okay.
I shared the link
Thank you, Fanny.
in the chat box.
Thank you.
So if you're interested in buying the book, there's a link in our chat box.
And perhaps I could add that if people log with you, Fanny, would it be okay that they are interested, that if they email you, you could actually send them the link just in case they miss it today?
Yes, of course.
Is that okay? I don't want you to get a deluge of emails, but
That's all right.
Another way of handling it, more personal way of handling it.
It's perfectly fine.
Yeah, thank you.
I can be reached through fernando.santiago@dlsu.edu.ph.
Good.
Okay, as we can ask our audience for any questions. So if you're interested, for example, in some of the process in writing, or if you're interested in some of the questions that you might have about Myanmar.
Actually, we're slightly over time.
Okay.
And that's perhaps the reason why some of them are hesitant.
Okay. Yeah.
Professor Dina Roma has a question.
Okay. Hi. Is my sound clear? My audio clear?
Yes.
Okay. Yes. Thank you so much, Professor Chris, for that wonderful talk and reading. I am just curious whether this is the first time that you've written a book of memoir, no? And I was just wondering how you managed to narrow down the material. I mean, because a memoir can go on and on. Like, what were the considerations for where to begin the memoir and where and when to end the memoir? Thank you.
Yes, Dina, that's a good question. As I think I mentioned, it started with me transcribing taped conversations with April's parents. Particularly her mother had a forensic memory. She's dead now, but she could recall incidents from 40, 50 years ago as if they happened yesterday. And that's when I thought I really must capture this. I had no intention at the time of doing anything other than writing it down. And her sister in Denmark, who left Myanmar or Burma at the same time, was also, and she is still alive. She's our last oral link with mid-century Burma. And once you get her with a glass of white wine, she just talks, and it just amazing detail. She actually was at school when the cabinet, you may know that in 1948, Aung San, that's Aung San Suu Kyi's father, was forming a government with different ethnic groups in the parliament buildings. And a terrorist, I guess you'd call him, burst into the room and machine gunned down all of everybody who was in the room. Jessie, April's aunt, was at school with a girl, and this friend came running up to Jessie and said, "Do you know what's happened? Do you know what's happened? There's been an assassination." And it turned out that the friend's father was suspected of being behind the assassination. And he was hanged later that week, and she never saw her friend again. And she talks, you know, she's like got a ringside view of all these events, and she talks in a very matter-of-fact way. It's very, you know, it's not hyped up. It's very sort of matter-of-fact, but it's incredible eyewitness accounts. That's just one example. So what I had was a whole lot of, if you like, anecdotal data. I'm tempted to call it ethnographic because it was very much based on the experience, the lived experience of the people at the time. It wasn't reconstructed. It wasn't somehow filtered. It was just raw, personal accounts. And then we started to visit Burma regularly, and we had conversations with a lot of the younger people. And sometimes this would just be over a coffee, or sometimes I would actually tape it. So I ended up with a whole lot of personal accounts. And I thought, well, this could, you know, when I retired from the university, I thought I'd really love to do some different creative writing rather than academic writing. So wonderfully freeing to just be more imaginative. And I did that. And then one of the reviews I got was, well, this is interesting, but where are you? Who are you? And where is your wife? We don't see them in this memoir. It was very backward looking. It was very, because there was a reference to 1852, you know, where April's great-great-grandfather was in the court of King Thebor and so on. And so I was urged to bring in a more personal thread to this story. And the more I did that, the more it kind of lifted off the page. And the more I began to find myself examining, if I can use that word, my relationship with April, and beginning to understand where we didn't really understand each other, or where we were at cross purposes, or I had things to learn about her, and maybe she had some things to learn about me and the British culture and so on. And so it became much more of a love story. And then I just, one criticism, and I say criticism in the best sense, was when somebody came back to me and they said, look, this is wonderful material. It's firsthand, it's alive, it's real, it's very readable. Is it a memoir, or are you giving us a social analysis of Myanmar? It's your choice, but you've got to choose between the two. And I found that quite helpful, because I realized it was a memoir. And you can't do both really at the same time. So essentially it's a memoir, which is why it's the title. But my hope is that along the way, if you like, as an observer or as a participant, and as somebody experiencing the food, the culture, the music, the religion, the flavors, the aromas, the tastes, and also our family experiencing that, then you pick up this multi-layered understanding of a country, rather than me setting out to say, well, okay, here's the social history, and here's the legislative background, and here's how the generals sort of came to power. I mean, it's there, but it's there as almost as a background if it's a film, you know, it's the background. You see it, you smell it, you touch it, but actually you're looking at the characters first of all, and then you almost look over their shoulders and see what's going on in the street. Do you understand? Does that help?
Oh, Professor Chris, we have several questions actually. So with the permission of Dr. Santiago, perhaps we can ask a good, because I think this is what happens with online lectures. The experience of time is different. So yes. Seems to be a lag. But the questions are pouring in now. We have 3 questions, and I think they're lovely questions. So I hope
Yes,
we
please.
have enough time.
It's fine. Yes, we can extend up to 6:30.
Okay.
So that should be enough time for the 3 questions. Thank you very much.
So we'll start with the longest question. So this is from our colleague in the department, Dr. Antonetta Rogo. So I'm just going to read her question. Thank you, Professor Chris. The tension you spoke of between the private and public, between memoir and testimony appears to me as the gap or the lacuna that Giorgio Agamben talks about when one is bearing witness to what is impossible to bear witness to. In this context, the intergenerational conflict in Myanmar and its trauma. What is moving is that your story of intercultural love seems to fill in that gap. What has your experience of writing this piece taught you about the distance between experience and the narration of that experience?
Between experience and, I missed the last bit.
About the distance between experience and the narration of that experience.
Okay. What a lovely question. I'd need to think about that. I think, let me say, I started off with a romantic picture of this far off country called Burma, you know, with Bengali tigers roaming in the forests and golden temples, Buddhist temples, and it was all wonderful, based on films and a few bits and pieces I'd read. And then, of course, you go there, and there's no substitute for the dust, the spices, just seeing the people on the side of the streets, clambering onto buses, exhaust fumes belching out, minus a bonnet, mopeds skidding past, and the people gracefully negotiating as they walk across the road, just slightly lifting their longi in their crisp white shirts and colored longi, just kind of zigzagging across this 5-lane highway to get to the other side. Somehow that just, and that's just one example, but those little cameo pictures, as you say, kind of said more than you can write about them, but there's an image in your head, and I suppose that the challenge, and also it's an enjoyable challenge, is how can I get that across to somebody who's sitting on a train, you know, commuting into London, for example, or commuting into Manila in your case. And it's the joy of bringing the senses to bear on what is a matter of fact, unremarkable cameo picture. But that cameo picture says so much. It tells me the people are having to get the bus into town every day because they're poor. It tells me that they have self-respect because they dress well. It tells me that they can put up with invading each other's social space because they crowd onto the buses. It tells me that they very rarely did I see an argument in public. despite all the deprivation. It tells me that these people are friendly, basically friendly, and patient with the horrendous traffic and the fumes and their life experience. You know, it's like you. I don't know whether I'm answering the question, but I suppose once that picture is there, the enjoyable task is to sort of introduce characters in their context so that you begin to believe in them, and they are all real. I mean, that's the other thing. I have made nothing up in this book. I maybe have shifted the scenery. I maybe have changed the colors or the exact time and place, but every person is somebody who I interacted with and had an impact on me. And I think I say towards the end of the book, I started out by trying to understand Burma, and I ended up by understanding myself a bit better, because I was changed by my interaction, my sustained interaction, not just with April and her family, who were anglicized anyway, but with their relatives who we go and see every time we go back, and the other people we spoke to, including, you know, Aung San Suu Kyi, who's a discredited leader now, and a chapter in my book addresses that her whole dilemma, but also the everyday people. And I guess it's the everyday people who are the revelation. You know, in Britain we moan, we put up with things, we criticize, we can become mean, we become stoic. Burmese people deal with their deprivation and it's much worse deprivation in a very different way. That's the best I can do to answer your question. It's a great question.
And I think that's also a very great response, and a lot of creative writers here are perhaps inspired by how you process all of those details and distill it in your narrative. So I think the second question is a little bit something to do with your writing process. So what motivated you to keep on writing the book? And who or what was your muse as you were writing your book?
What was my
muse or inspiration? Inspiration.
Inspiration. I'm sure most of you have experience of writing academically, and I think I became rather disillusioned. I don't want to put you off, but I became rather disillusioned with the way you have to just justify every sentence, the way you have to stuff your article full of references, and the way you have to be impersonal and talk about things in an objective way. Creative writing is the opposite of all of that. You're writing from your own experience, you're writing freely, imaginatively, creatively, and yes, it's researched. As if any of you have read the book, you'll see that there's probably 4 or 5 pages of referencing. So it's not that the book is how can I put it? It's reputable. You know, it is. If you wanted to pursue a particular point I'm making, you can go to the back and get hold of a book or a report and see for yourself. But I didn't want to bog the text down. I did start using footnotes, but then somebody said, come on, this is getting in the way. So I actually removed them and put them at the back. So the inspiration, I really didn't need too much inspiration, because I guess it was all there building up in me. And as soon as I had the opportunity to clear the desk of my textbooks, I just began to write, and it was so much fun. And I would recommend, as I've mentioned twice now, I think, external review. You know, not friends, not family, although you can put let them see it as well. But go to people who are writers and get there. And I paid for that. I paid because I felt it was worthwhile, and you can't just ask them to use their own time. So twice I got the book reviewed, and they were absolutely spot on. It was essential to move it from a social analysis to a memoir, and then secondly to bring in April's voice. And I left myself out of the first version because as an academic you don't talk about yourself, but the person said, look, who are you to write? To put it bluntly, we need to know with what authority you're making these observations. And so I put a whole chapter in about my university days and about my belief system. And I think it benefited from that, because then people see where you're coming from. They may not agree, they may not sympathize with everything that you're saying about yourself, but at least they know where you're coming from, and you have a degree of authority in the best sense to be making these observations.
Thank you very much. So our last question is a little bit different. So it's more about politics of Myanmar. What do you think are the founding and binding principle of Myanmar as a nation? And how does it differ from your own country?
The founding
And binding principles of Myanmar.
It's really difficult.
Yes, I was thinking about it.
I wish I could just rattle off 5 things, but I don't think I can. I think, as I mentioned earlier, it's a multi-layered nation. You know, the top layer is the romantic, exquisite, mysterious, photogenic layer. And you can stay there. You can get a package tour. Well, you can't now, but you used to get a package tour, you know, catch the boat in Rangoon and just steam up the river to Bagan and to Mandalay, and you would see what the generals want you to see. Very picturesque, very peaceful, and you take hundreds of pictures. And then you peel back a layer and you see the people in the streets that, again, I've referred to, barely holding life together. You know, education, and I can't emphasize how fortunate we here in this webinar are to have the opportunity for secondary and then tertiary education. We take it for granted. We see it almost as an entitlement. They don't have that in Myanmar. It's just rubbish. I mean, I can say that based on many conversations with people who are working in the educational field. You know, kids sitting at makeshift desks in the open air doing exams. Just one picture that comes to mind. Teachers that don't turn up for your secondary school class because they get paid so poorly. So they're off tutoring privately the more privileged kids. Sort of 20% of the population over 21 have a degree. You know, so education isn't everything, but it's for me a building block in a country that has self-respect and is, because the other thing about education is it's often very pedagogic. And I had a Burmese PhD student in London, and she actually finished her doctorate, but she was remarkable and was very there are very few working at that level. It's not because they're not bright, it's just because the education system hasn't prepared them to be critical. And you can see immediately then, if this is the second layer, you know, if there isn't the people are angry, but there's a difference between being angry and being critical. Critical means you've got an alternative. Critical means you've got a way of, if you like, backing up your criticism with comparative reports or with other scenarios. You're weighing up different things and you're able to come up with an informed opinion. You go down another layer and you find that you're not backed up by the law. I've mentioned this again. Legislatively, you're very vulnerable in Burma. If you're in one of the ethnic groups, you have no land rights, you have no rights to any kind of social services. You're on your own. So founding principles, you know, it's difficult because you're talking about very different layers, very different conceptions of society. And of course, we haven't yet got to the people who are right on the poverty line and as UNESCO say, will fall into poverty this year. And yet, if you came across them, they would invite you in, find a chicken from somewhere and put a wonderful chicken curry in front of you. And they wouldn't think twice about the fact that they therefore couldn't afford something next week because they've given it to you. So, you know, this is, it's not, I'm afraid it's not easy to say founding principles because you've got these layers and it depends who you're talking to as to how you answer that question.
Thank you very much, Professor Chris. I think we are at the end of our question and answer. But before I give it back to Dr. Santiago, I really encourage everyone to buy the book and read the book, because if you're interested in memoir, in writing, if you're interested in Myanmar, its history, its rich culture, and even its food, because the descriptions of food here are wonderful. I can remember all the food that I tasted when I was in Yangon, and this is just and if you're interested in traveling to Myanmar, so all of these interests, you'll be able to enjoy the book. So I really hope that many of you will be interested in buying. So thank you very much, Professor Chris, and thank you very much, Dr. Santiago.
Thank you, Dr. Piocos, for your comments, your insights, okay, and also for leading the Q&A. Now, this has been a wonderful webinar, and I regret that we must end this event. Now, to deliver the closing remarks, ladies and gentlemen, the Director of the Bienvenido and Santos Creative Writing Center, Dr. Ronald Baitan.
To our distinguished guest, Professor Mabey, to our administrators, and to everyone, good evening. Following the work of Philip Holden, Other Modernities, National Autobiography, and Globalization, we can say that creative nonfiction, being a literature concerned with facts, with truth, plays an important role in exploring the complexities of modernities in the contemporary world. Autobiographies, biographies, and memoirs are vital to the work of narrating the nation, to use Homi Bhabha's work. Aside from careful attention to language and strict adherence to research, nonfiction allows writers to go beyond the trappings of exoticism and Orientalist fantasies, and to speak from their own subject position about an other with conviction, self-reflexivity, and empathy. In Professor Mabey's insightful sharing today, and in his family memoir titled Whispers of Hope, we bear witness to not only a love story between two individuals from different worlds, but also the challenges of crafting that story against the backdrop of Myanmar's history. We are offered insights on the socio-political and cultural forces that have led to Myanmar's beleaguered present, as well as the forces that fuel and deflect attempts at restoring peace in Myanmar. On behalf of the Southeast Asia Research Center and Hub, the Department of Literature, and the Benvenido and Santos Creative Writing Center, I wish to offer Professor Mabey our profound thanks for giving us a nuanced analysis of the situation in Myanmar at present, for sharing his insights on the creative process, and for offering us glimpses of hope. Thank you as well to all of you for attending today's webinar, as we all brace for a new normal, and hopefully a new normal that upholds human rights and promotes the values of peace, equality, and equity in Myanmar, in the Philippines, in Ukraine, and the rest of the world. As we always say in the Philippines, mabuhay. God bless. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Baitan. And thank you everyone for joining us. We hope to see you again in our upcoming webinars. Bye for now.